Long before crime syndicates had names and intelligence at satellites, there was only one man standing between order and chaos: Sherlock Holmes. By the 1890s, Holmes had become a phenomenon, but Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the brilliant doctor-turned-author, began to feel suffocated by the very character who made him famous. "I am weary of his name," he wrote in frustration. In a heartfelt letter to his mother, he confessed, "I must save my mind for better things. If I don't kill Holmes, he'll kill me." And so, in 1893, in The Final Problem, Doyle hurled Holmes over the Reichenbach Falls, believing he had ended the detective's story forever. The world reacted with grief and rage. Readers were black. Magazine subscriptions plummeted, but Doyle remained unmoved for 10 years. Under intense public pressure, and perhaps moved by time, Doyle resurrected the great detective in 1903 with The Adventure of the Empty House. Holmes hadn't died. He had faked his death, gone underground, and watched the remnants of Moriarty's empire unravel. In this tale, Holmes returns to London, covert, calculating, and ready to strike. His target? Colonel Sebastian Moran, the last venomous fang of a slain serpent. This isn't just a story of survival. It's one of revenge, redemption, and the brilliance of a mind always 5 steps ahead. So if you believe that justice never truly dies, and that legends can outwit even their creators, then step into the shadows once more. This is The Adventure of the Empty House. It was in the spring of the year 1894 that all of London found itself captivated, and the fashionable world horrified by the murder of the Honorable Ronald Adair, carried out under the most unusual and inexplicable circumstances. The public had already learned the main details of the crime from the police investigation, but many facts had been deliberately withheld at that time. The case for the prosecution had been so overwhelmingly strong that it wasn't necessary to disclose everything. Now, after nearly 10 years, I am finally allowed to reveal the missing links in this extraordinary chain of events. While the crime itself was intriguing, to me it paled in comparison to what followed, the most shocking and unexpected event of my entire adventurous life. Even now, after all these years, I still shiver when I think about it, and I recall the overwhelming surge of joy, amazement, and disbelief that consumed me that day. Let me say this to the public. Those who have taken interest in the glimpses I've occasionally offered into the life of an extraordinary man, they must not blame me for withholding my knowledge. I would have shared it had I not been strictly forbidden by him personally. That restriction was only lifted on the 3rd of last month. It is no surprise that my close friendship with Sherlock Holmes had left me deeply interested in criminal matters. After his disappearance, I made it a point never to miss a report on any significant crime. For my own satisfaction, I even tried, more than once, to apply Holmes's methods to solve a few cases, though, I must admit, with limited success. None of those mysteries, however, ever captivated me like the tragedy of Ronald Adair. As I read the inquest evidence, which ultimately resulted in a verdict of willful murder by an unknown person or persons, I realized, more than ever before, just how much we had lost with Holmes's death. There were aspects of this strange case that, I was certain, would have fascinated him. Had he been alive, I believe the police efforts would have either been enhanced, or more likely, outpaced by the sharp mind and keen observation of the finest criminal investigator in Europe. Throughout the day, as I drove on my medical rounds, the case kept returning to my mind. Yet no theory I formed felt sufficient or satisfactory. Still, at the risk of repeating what is already known, I shall now recap the publicly available facts as revealed at the conclusion of the inquest. The Honorable Ronald Adair was the second son of the Earl of Maynooth, who at that time was the governor of an Australian colony. Lady Maynooth had returned from Australia to undergo cataract surgery and was living at 427 Park Lane with her son Ronald and her daughter Hilda. Ronald moved within the highest social circles. He was believed to have no enemies and no vices of any significance. He had been engaged to Miss Edith Woodley of Carstairs, But that engagement had ended by mutual agreement several months earlier. There were no signs that it had left any lasting emotional impact. Other than that, his life followed a quiet, conventional routine. He had an even temperament and led an uneventful existence. Yet it was upon this calm and respectable young aristocrat that death came, in the strangest and most unexpected form, sometime between 10 o'clock and 11:20 on the night of March 30th, 1894. Ronald Adair was fond of card games. He played regularly, though never for stakes that would have harmed him financially. He was a member of the Baldwin, the Cavendish, and the Bagatelle card clubs. Evidence showed that on the day of his death, he had played a rubber of whist at the Bagatelle Club after dinner, and also that same afternoon. Testimonies from his fellow players, Mr. Murray, Sir John Hardy, and Colonel Moran, confirmed that the game was indeed whist, and that the hands had been evenly matched. Adair may have lost around £5, but no more. Given his considerable fortune, this was a negligible amount. He played nearly every day, usually winning due to his cautious playing style. One noteworthy point revealed during the investigation was that, just weeks earlier, he and Colonel Moran had won as much as £420 in a single sitting from Godfrey Milner and Lord Balmoral. This summed up the recent background of Ronald Adair as it emerged during the inquiry. On the night of his death, he returned from the club exactly at 10 o'clock. His mother and sister were out visiting a relative. The household servant testified that she heard him go into the front room on the second floor, which he used as his sitting room. She had lit a fire there earlier, but because it smoked, she had opened the window. From that point until 11:20, when Lady Maynooth and Miss Hilda returned, no sound was heard from the room. Wishing to say goodnight to Ronald, they approached his door. It was locked from the inside, and no response came despite their calls and knocking. Help was summoned, and the door was eventually forced open. There, near the table, lay the unfortunate young man. His head had been horribly disfigured by an expanding revolver bullet. Strangely, no weapon was found in the room. On the table, there were 2 £10 banknotes and £17 tin in silver and gold, arranged neatly in small piles. A sheet of paper was also found, bearing figures and the names of some of his club acquaintances. It appeared that, before his death, he had been calculating his card game winnings or losses. A minute examination of the circumstances only served to make the case more perplexing. First of all, no reason could be determined as to why the young man would have locked the door from the inside. It was possible, of course, that the murderer had done so and then escaped through the window. However, the drop was at least 20 feet, and there was a bed of crocuses in full bloom directly beneath. Neither the flowers nor the soil showed any signs of disturbance, nor were there any footprints or marks on the narrow strip of grass that separated the house from the road. It therefore appeared that the young man had indeed locked the door himself. But then how had he come to his death? No one could have climbed up to the window without leaving traces. Suppose someone had fired the shot from the street. It would take a phenomenal marksman to deliver such a fatal wound with a revolver from that distance. Moreover, Park Lane is a busy thoroughfare. There is a cab stand within 100 yards of the house. No one had heard gunshot, and yet there lay the lifeless body and the revolver bullet, mushroomed outward, as soft-nosed bullets do, causing a wound that must have resulted in instantaneous death. Such are the details of the Park Lane mystery. They were made all the more puzzling by the complete absence of motive. As I've said, young Adair was not known to have any enemies, and no attempt had been made to steal the money or valuables in the room. All day long, I pondered over these facts, trying to develop a theory that could make sense of them all, seeking that line of least resistance, which my poor friend Holmes always said was the starting point for any investigation. I have to admit, I made very little progress. That evening, I wandered across the park and found myself, around 6 o'clock, at the Oxford Street Inn of Park Lane. There I saw a small crowd of idle onlookers gathered on the pavement, all staring up at a particular window. That told me I had arrived at the right house. Among them stood a tall, thin man wearing tinted glasses. I strongly suspected he was a plainclothes detective. He was animatedly explaining some theory of his own to the group around him, who listened with rapt attention. I edged closer to hear what he had to say. But to me, his explanation seemed absurd. Disappointed, I turned away. As I did so, I accidentally bumped into an elderly, deformed man who had been standing behind me. In the process, I knocked down several books he had been carrying. As I stooped to pick them up, I happened to notice the title of one of them, The Origin of Tree Worship. It struck me that this fellow must be a poor bibliophile, either by trade or passion, collecting obscure old volumes. I tried to apologize for the mishap, but it was clear that the books were very precious to him. With a snarl of contempt, he turned on his heel, and I watched his hunched back and white side whiskers disappear into the crowd. My observations of number 427 Park Lane did little to solve the mystery that so intrigued me. The house was separated from the street by a low wall and iron railings, no more than 5 feet high. It would have been quite easy for anyone to enter the garden, but the window itself was completely inaccessible. There was no drain pipe or support that even the most agile man could have used to climb up. More puzzled than ever, I returned to my home in Kensington. I had barely been in my study 5 minutes when the maid entered to announce that someone wished to see me. To my astonishment, it was the same strange old book collector. His sharp, withered face peered out from a frame of white hair, and under his right arm he held a dozen of his precious books, tightly wedged together.
"You're surprised to see me, sir,"
he said in a strange, croaking voice. I admitted that I was.
"Well, I've got a conscience, sir. And when I saw you going into this house while I was hobbling along behind, I thought to myself, I'll just step in and see that kind gentleman. I want to let him know that if I was a bit gruff in my manner, no harm was meant. And I'm truly grateful to him for picking up my books."
You make too much of trifle. May I ask how you knew who I was?
"Well, sir, if it isn't too great a liberty, I am a neighbor of yours, for you'll find my little bookshop at the corner of Church Street, and very happy to see you, I'm sure. Maybe you collect yourself, sir. Here's British Birds and Catullus, and the Holy War, a bargain, every one of them. With 5 volumes, you could just fill that gap on that second shelf. It looks untidy, doesn't it, sir?"
I turned my head to glance at the cabinet behind me, but when I looked back, Sherlock Holmes was standing across my study table, smiling at me. I rose to my feet, stared at him in stunned silence for several seconds, and then, so it seems, I must have fainted for the first and only time in my life. A swirling gray mist clouded my vision, and when it cleared, I found the ends of my collar loosened and the burning aftertaste of brandy on my lips. Holmes was leaning over me, a flask in his hand.
"My dear Watson, I owe you 1,000 apologies. I had no idea you would be so affected."
I grabbed his arms and cried out, "Holmes, is it really you? Can it truly be that you're alive? Did you actually escape from that awful abyss?"
"Wait a moment. Are you sure you're fit to talk? My unnecessarily dramatic reappearance seems to have given you quite a shock."
"I'm fine now, Holmes, but honestly, I can hardly believe my eyes. Good heavens, to think that you, of all men, are standing here in my study." Again, I grasped his sleeve and felt the lean, sinewy arm beneath it. "Well, you're no ghost, that's for certain. My dear fellow, I'm overjoyed to see you. Sit down and tell me, how in the world did you survive that dreadful fall?" Holmes took the seat opposite mine and lit a cigarette in his familiar, nonchalant manner. He was still dressed in the worn frock coat of the book dealer, but the rest of the disguise, white hair and old books, lay in a heap on the table. He looked even thinner and more intense than before, but the pale, ashen tint in his hawk-like face told me that his recent life had been anything but healthy.
"I'm glad to stretch out, Watson. It's no joke for a tall man to shrink a foot in height for hours on end. Now, my dear fellow, regarding explanations, we have a difficult and dangerous night's work ahead of us. If I may ask for your help, perhaps it's best I explain everything after tonight's business is done."
I'm brimming with curiosity. I'd much rather hear it now.
"You'll come with me tonight?"
Anytime, anywhere.
"This really is like old times. We've still got time for a quick dinner before we leave. Well then, about that chasm. I had no real difficulty escaping it, for the very simple reason that I never fell into it.
You never were in it?
No, Watson, I never was in it. My note to you was entirely genuine. I honestly believed that my career had reached its end when I saw the ominous figure of Professor Moriarty standing on the narrow path that led to safety. I could see an unyielding determination in his gray eyes. We exchanged a few words, and he graciously allowed me to write the short note you later received. I left it behind, along with my cigarette case and walking stick, and I walked along the path, Moriarty close behind me. When I reached the end, I stood my ground. He didn't pull a weapon, but he rushed at me and wrapped his long arms around me. He knew his game was over and was determined to take me down with him. We struggled together on the edge of the cliff. Fortunately, I have some knowledge of Baritsu, the Japanese system of wrestling. It's come in handy more than once. I slipped out of his grasp. He let out a horrible scream, kicked wildly for a few seconds, and clawed at the air with both hands. But for all his efforts, he couldn't regain his balance, and over he went. I looked over the edge and watched him fall, down and down. He struck a rock, bounced off it, and finally splashed into the water below.
I listened, utterly amazed, as Holmes recounted his story between puffs from his cigarette. I said, "But the tracks. I saw, with my own eyes, that two went down the path and none returned."
It came about in this way. The instant that the professor had disappeared, it struck me what an extraordinarily lucky chance fate had placed in my hands. I knew Moriarty wasn't the only one who had sworn to see me dead. There were at least 3 others whose thirst for revenge would only grow stronger after the death of their leader. All of them were extremely dangerous. One or another would certainly get me eventually. On the other hand, if the entire world believed I was dead, these men would let their guard down. They'd become reckless, and when they did, I could bring them down one by one. Only then would it be time for me to reveal that I was still among the living. My brain worked so quickly that I believe I had thought all this through before Moriarty had even hit the bottom of the Reichenbach Fall. I stood up and examined the rocky wall behind me. In your very picturesque account of the events, which I read with great interest some months later, you stated that the wall was sheer. That wasn't entirely true. A few small footholds were visible, and there seemed to be the hint of a ledge. The cliff was so high that climbing all the way up was clearly impossible, and making my way back along the wet path would have left obvious tracks. I could have, it's true, reversed my boots, as I've done on similar occasions, but seeing 3 sets of footprints going in one direction would have made it clear that there was some trickery involved. All in all, it was best to attempt the climb. Believe me, Watson, it wasn't a pleasant task. The waterfall roared beneath me. I'm not a fanciful person, but I swear to you that I thought I heard Moriarty's voice screaming up at me from the depths. One slip would have been fatal. More than once, when tufts of grass came away in my hands or my foot slid on the wet rock, I thought it was over. But I kept climbing and finally reached a ledge, a few feet deep and covered with soft green moss, where I could lie in total comfort and remain unseen. That's where I lay, stretched out, while you, my dear Watson, and your party investigated, as sympathetically as you were inefficiently, the circumstances of my supposed death. At last, when you had all drawn your inevitable but completely mistaken conclusions, you returned to the hotel, and I was left alone. I had thought that was the end of my adventures, but a very unexpected incident proved that more surprises were in store. A huge rock suddenly crashed past me, hit the path below, and tumbled into the chasm. At first I thought it was just an accident, but then I looked up and saw a man's head silhouetted against the darkening sky. Another stone smashed into the very ledge where I lay, barely a foot from my head. The meaning was clear. Moriarty hadn't come alone. He had an accomplice, and even in that brief glance, I could tell how dangerous he was. This man had stayed behind, watching while the professor confronted me. He saw his friend fall and witnessed my escape. Then he circled around to the top of the cliff, trying to finish what Moriarty had started. I didn't take long to react, Watson. I saw that grim face once more looking over the edge, and I knew another stone was on its way. I scrambled down onto the path. I don't think I could have done it calmly, but I had no time to think about danger. Another stone came whizzing past, just as I was hanging from the edge. Halfway down, I slipped, but by the grace of God, I landed on the path, bruised, torn, and bleeding. I took off at once, ran 10 miles over the mountains in the dark, and 1 week later I was in Florence, with the certainty that no soul on earth knew what had become of me. I had only one confidant, my brother Mycroft. I owe you many apologies, my dear Watson, but it was crucial that everyone believed I was dead, and I'm certain that your account of my supposed demise wouldn't have been so convincing if you hadn't truly believed it yourself. Several times over the past 3 years, I've picked up my pen to write to you, but each time I held back. I feared your affectionate nature might lead you to some well-meaning indiscretion that could give away my secret. That's why I turned away from you this evening when you knocked over my books. I was still in danger then, and any sign of recognition or emotion from you might have drawn attention to who I really was, and that could have led to disastrous consequences. As for Mycroft, I had to confide in him to obtain the money I needed. Things in London didn't go as smoothly as I had hoped. The trial of Moriarty's gang left 2 of its most dangerous members, my own bitter enemies, still at large. So, I traveled for 2 years in Tibet. I visited Lhasa and spent some time with the head lama. You may have read about the Norwegian explorer named Sigerson. That was me, though I doubt it ever crossed your mind that you were hearing about your old friend. After that, I passed through Persia, visited Mecca, and made a brief but interesting stop at Khartoum, where I met the Khalifa. I sent the results of that visit to the Foreign Office. Later, I returned to France and spent several months researching coal tar derivatives in a laboratory in Montpellier, in the south. When I had finished that work, and upon learning that only one of my enemies remained in London, I was preparing to return. But the news of the Park Lane mystery hastened my movements. Not only was it intriguing in itself, but it also offered unique personal opportunities. I came back to London at once, went to Baker Street in person, sent Mrs. Hudson into violent hysterics, and found that Mycroft had kept my rooms and papers exactly as they were. So, my dear Watson, at 2 o'clock today, I was sitting once again in my old armchair, in my old room, wishing more than anything that I could see my old friend Watson in the chair opposite, where he belonged.
Such was the incredible story I listened to on that April evening. A tale I would have dismissed as pure fiction if it weren't confirmed by the very sight of the tall, lean figure and that sharp, eager face I had never thought to see again. Somehow, Holmes had learned of my own personal loss, and though he said little, his sympathy was evident in his manner.
Work is the best antidote to sorrow, my dear Watson, and tonight I have a task for both of us, one that, if we succeed, will alone justify a man's life on this earth.
I begged him in vain to tell me more.
You'll see and hear enough before morning. We've got 3 years of the past to talk about. Let that be enough until 9:30, when we begin the adventure of the empty house.
It truly felt like the old days again. At the appointed time, I found myself seated beside him in a hansom cab, my revolver in my pocket, and that familiar thrill of adventure in my chest. Holmes was cold, silent, and stern. The streetlights flickered over his serious face, and I noticed how his brows were drawn in concentration and his thin lips pressed tightly together. I didn't know what wild beast we were hunting in the dark alleys of criminal London, but I could tell from his demeanor that the matter was deadly serious, and the occasional sardonic smile that flickered across his face didn't bode well for our target. At first, I thought we were heading to Baker Street, but Holmes stopped the cab at the corner of Cavendish Square. As he stepped down, I noticed he glanced cautiously in both directions. At every street corner after that, he took extreme care to make sure we weren't being followed. Our route was certainly unusual. Holmes's knowledge of London's back streets was remarkable, and on this night he led us swiftly and confidently through a maze of alleys, stables, and mews I'd never even known existed. Eventually, we came to a small lane lined with old, gloomy houses. From there we passed into Manchester Street, then on to Blandford Street. Here, Holmes suddenly turned down a narrow passage, slipped through a wooden gate into a deserted yard, and unlocked the back door of a house with a key. We entered, and he quietly shut the door behind us. It was pitch dark inside, but I could tell at once the place was empty. Our footsteps echoed over bare wooden floors, and my outstretched hand brushed against wallpaper hanging in torn strips. Holmes's cold, bony fingers wrapped around my wrist and guided me down a long hall until I could faintly make out the fanlight above the front door. At that point, Holmes turned sharply to the right, and we entered a large, square, empty room. The corners were swallowed in deep shadow, but the center was dimly lit by the glow of street lamps filtering through a dirty window. There was no lamp inside, and the window was so thick with grime that we could barely see each other's outlines. My companion placed his hand on my shoulder and leaned close to my ear.
Do you know where we are?
Surely that is Baker Street, I said, staring through the dim window.
Exactly. We are in Camden House, which stands directly across from our old quarters.
But why are we here?
Because it offers an excellent view of that picturesque pile. Would you mind, my dear Watson, stepping a bit closer to the window, taking every care not to be seen, and then looking up at our old rooms, the very starting point of so many of your little fairy tales? Let's see if 3 years of absence have robbed me of my ability to surprise you.
I crept forward and looked across at the familiar window. As soon as my eyes landed on it, I gasped and cried out in amazement. The blind was drawn, and a bright light shone in the room. The shadow of a man sitting in a chair was clearly outlined on the luminous curtain. There was no mistaking it. The posture of the head, the square shoulders, the sharp features. His face was turned slightly to the side, and the silhouette looked exactly like those old-fashioned cutouts our grandparents used to frame. It was a perfect likeness of Holmes. I was so stunned that I reached out to touch the man standing beside me, just to make sure he was really there. Holmes was shaking with silent laughter.
Well,
Good heavens, it's marvelous,
I hope age doesn't wither me or custom dull my infinite variety.
he said, and I could hear the joy and pride of an artist admiring his own work.
It really does look like me, doesn't it?
I'd be ready to swear it was you.
The credit for the craftsmanship goes to Monsieur Oscar Meunier of Grenoble. He spent several days molding it. It's a wax figure. The rest I arranged myself during my visit to Baker Street this afternoon.
I still don't understand. Why would he do that?
Because, my dear Watson, I had the strongest reason to make certain people believe I was there when I was actually elsewhere.
And you thought the rooms were being watched?
I knew they were being watched.
By whom?
By my old enemies, Watson. By that charming society whose leader now lies at the bottom of the Reichenbach Fall. You must remember they, and only they, knew I was still alive. They were certain I'd eventually return to my rooms. They watched them constantly, and this morning they saw me arrive.
How can you be so sure?
Because I recognized their lookout when I glanced out the window. He's a harmless enough fellow, name's Parker, a garroter by trade, and quite the performer on the Jew's harp. I wasn't worried about him, but I was very concerned about the more dangerous man behind him, Moriarty's close friend, the one who dropped the rocks over the cliff, the most cunning and dangerous criminal in London. That's who's after me tonight, Watson, and he doesn't yet know that we're after him.
My friend's strategy was becoming clear. From this hidden vantage point, the watchers were being watched and the trackers tracked. That angular shadow in the window was the bait, and we were the hunters. We stood together in silence, shrouded in darkness, watching the passers-by rushing along the street below. Holmes was motionless, but I could feel how alert he was. His eyes were locked on the steady stream of people walking past. It was a cold, blustery night, and the wind whistled fiercely down the long street. Many were moving about, bundled in coats and scarves. A couple of times I thought I recognized the same figure passing by, and 2 men in particular caught my attention. They were standing in the doorway of a house some distance up the road, trying to shelter themselves from the wind. I tried to point them out to Holmes, but he made a short sound of impatience and continued watching the street. He shifted his feet and tapped his fingers quickly against the wall. I could tell he was becoming uneasy. Things were not unfolding as he had expected. As midnight neared and the street began to empty, he started pacing restlessly across the room. I was just about to say something when I looked back up at the lit window, and once again, I was hit by a shock nearly as strong as before. I clutched Holmes's arm and pointed upward. I cried out, "The shadow has moved."
Of course it has moved. Am I such a farcical bungler, Watson, that I should erect an obvious dummy and expect that some of the sharpest men in Europe would be deceived by it? We have been in this room 2 hours, and Mrs. Hudson has made some change in that figure 8 times, or once in every quarter of an hour. She works it from the front, so that her shadow may never be seen. Ah!
He drew in his breath sharply. I saw his head shoot forward, every muscle rigid with alertness. Outside, the street lay still and deserted. Though I could no longer see them, those 2 men might still be crouched in the distant doorway. The only illumination came from the bright, yellow-lit window opposite us, where the shadow of the seated figure was cast in silhouette. Then, in the deep silence, I heard it too, the softest of noises, unmistakably a sound from within our own building, not from the street. A door opened and shut. Footsteps began to move stealthily down the hallway, meant to be silent, but echoing sharply in the empty house. Holmes pressed me against the wall, his cold fingers gripping my wrist. I followed suit, gripping the handle of my revolver. From the shadows, I watched as a vague figure, darker than the darkness, paused in the doorway. Then he crept forward, menacing, unaware of our presence. He moved toward the window, crouched low, and carefully opened it a few inches. The light now fell fully on his face. He was clearly in a state of wild excitement. His eyes gleamed unnaturally, his face contorted with anticipation. The man was elderly, with a gaunt, swarthy complexion, a hawk-like nose, and grizzled mustache. An opera hat rested on his head, and a gleam of a formal shirt front showed through his overcoat. In his hand, he held a metallic-looking stick which clanged faintly as he set it down. Then, he retrieved a heavy object from his pocket and worked on it with focused intensity, until a mechanical click signaled the completion of some deadly preparation. He loaded it at the breech, clearly a strange sort of gun, and then crouched by the open window, resting the barrel on the ledge. He sighted down its length toward the shadowy figure across the street. With a satisfied sigh, he cuddled the butt into his shoulder, taking aim. There was a loud whiz and a crash of glass. At that moment, Holmes launched himself at the man like a tiger. The attacker fought back fiercely, his hands locking around Holmes's throat. But I brought the butt of my revolver down upon his head, and he collapsed. I pinned him to the ground as Holmes blew sharply on a whistle. Almost instantly, footsteps thundered down the street. 2 uniformed officers and a plainclothes detective burst into the room.
That you, Lestrade?
Yes, Mr. Holmes. I took the job myself. It's good to see you back in London, sir.
I think you want a little unofficial help. 3 undetected murders in 1 year won't do, Lestrade. But you handled the Molesey mystery with less than your usual. That's to say, you handled it fairly well.
We all stood, our prisoner gasping for breath, flanked by 2 constables. Curious bystanders were already gathering in the street. Holmes stepped to the window, closed it, and drew the blinds. Lestrade lit 2 candles, and the officers opened their lanterns. At last, I got a clear look at our captive. It was a face both formidable and dangerous, the upper half like that of a philosopher, the lower that of a brute. Whatever potential this man had for good had long been overwhelmed by evil. His cold blue eyes, cynical lids, aggressive nose, and deeply lined brow left no room for doubt. The man was a predator. He paid no attention to the rest of us. His gaze was fixed on Holmes, burning with both hatred and astonishment.
You fiend! You clever, clever fiend!
Ah, Colonel. Journeys end in lovers' meetings, as the old play says. I don't think I've had the pleasure of seeing you since you favored me with those attentions as I lay on the ledge above the Reichenbach Fall.
The colonel still stared at Holmes, as if he were in a trance.
You cunning, cunning fiend!
I haven't introduced you yet. Gentlemen, this is Colonel Sebastian Moran, once of Her Majesty's Indian Army, and the best heavy game shot that our Eastern Empire has ever produced. I believe I'm correct, Colonel, in saying that your bag of tigers still remains unrivaled?
The fierce old man said nothing, only glared at Holmes. With his savage eyes and bristling mustache, he looked remarkably like a tiger himself.
I wonder that my very simple stratagem could deceive so old a shikari. It must be quite familiar to you. Haven't you ever tethered a young kid under a tree, lain above it with your rifle, and waited for the bait to bring up your tiger? Well, this empty house is my tree, and you are my tiger. You've possibly had other guns in reserve in case there were several tigers, or in the unlikely event of your own aim failing. These, he gestured around, are my other guns. The parallel is exact.
Colonel Moran sprang forward with a snarl of rage, but the constables held him back. The fury on his face was terrible to witness.
I must confess you had one small surprise for me. I hadn't anticipated that you would yourself make use of this empty house and its convenient front window. I imagined you working from the street, where my friend Lestrade and his merry men were waiting. Aside from that, everything went just as I had expected.
You may or may not have just cause for arresting me, but at least there's no reason why I should have to endure the jibes of this person. If I'm in the hands of the law, let things proceed in a legal manner.
Well, that's reasonable enough. Mr. Holmes, anything else before we go?
Holmes had picked up the powerful air gun from the floor and was closely examining its intricate mechanism.
An admirable and unique weapon, noiseless, and of tremendous power. I knew von Herder, the blind German mechanic who constructed it at the order of the late Professor Moriarty. I've known of its existence for years, though this is the first time I've had the chance to handle it. I commend it especially to your attention, Lestrade, and the bullets that fit it.
You can trust us to look after that, Mr. Holmes. Anything further?
Only to ask, what charge do you intend to prefer?
What charge, sir? Why, of course, the attempted murder of Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
Not so, Lestrade. I don't propose to appear in the matter at all. To you, and to you only, belongs the credit for this remarkable arrest. Yes, Lestrade, I congratulate you. With your usual happy mixture of cunning and audacity, you've got him.
Got him? Got whom, Mr. Holmes?
The man the whole force has been seeking in vain, Colonel Sebastian Moran, who shot the Honorable Ronald Adair with an expanding bullet from an air gun through the open window of the second-floor front of number 427, Park Lane, on the 30th of last month. That's the charge, Lestrade. And now, Watson, if you can endure the draft from a broken window, I think that half an hour in my study over a cigar may provide you with some pleasant amusement.
Our old chambers had remained untouched, thanks to Mycroft Holmes's oversight and Mrs. Hudson's constant care. As I stepped inside, I noticed an unusual tidiness, but all the familiar landmarks were still there. The chemical corner, the acid-stained, deal-top table, the row of heavy scrapbooks and reference volumes, books that many citizens would have eagerly burned, were all present. So were the diagrams, the violin case, the pipe rack, and even the Persian slipper that held Holmes's tobacco. As I scanned the room, I saw two figures, Mrs. Hudson, beaming at us as we entered, and the strange dummy that had played such a vital role in the night's events. It was a wax-colored likeness of Holmes, crafted so skillfully that it was an exact replica. It stood on a pedestal table, draped in one of Holmes's old dressing gowns, so that from the street, the illusion was flawless.
I hope you observed all precautions, Mrs. Hudson.
Mrs. Hudson assured him that she had followed his instructions to the letter, even working on her knees to avoid casting any shadows.
Excellent. You carried the thing out very well. Did you observe where the bullet went?
Mrs. Hudson replied that, unfortunately, it had ruined the bust, piercing straight through the head and embedding itself in the wall. She had retrieved the flattened bullet from the carpet and handed it to Holmes.
A soft revolver bullet, as you see, Watson. Ingenious, really. No one would expect such a thing fired from an air gun. All right, Mrs. Hudson. I'm very much obliged for your help. And now, Watson, take your old seat. There are several matters I want to discuss with you.
He had shed his worn frock coat and was once again the Holmes I knew, clad in the familiar mouse-colored dressing gown, borrowed now from his own effigy.
The old shikari's nerves haven't lost their edge, nor his eyesight its sharpness. Dead center at the back of the head, clean through the brain. He was the best shot in India, and likely among the top in London. Ever heard the name?
No, I haven't.
Well, so much for fame. But then, if I remember right, you hadn't heard of Professor James Moriarty either, and he had one of the greatest minds of the century. Hand me my index of biographies from the shelf.
Leaning back in his chair and puffing thick clouds from his cigar, Holmes flipped through the pages lazily.
My collection of M's is quite distinguished. Moriarty alone makes the letter notable. Then there's Morgan the Poisoner, Meridew of vile memory Matthews, who knocked out my left canine at Charing Cross. And finally, here's tonight's guest.
He handed me the book. I read aloud. Moran, Sebastian, Colonel. Unemployed. Formerly 1st Bangalore Pioneers. Born London, 1840. Son of Sir Augustus Moran, C.B., once British minister to Persia. Educated at Eton and Oxford. Served in the Jawaki campaign, Afghan campaign, Karaziab dispatches, Sherpur, and Kabul. Author of Heavy Game of the Western Himalayas, 1881. 3 Months in the Jungle, 1884. Address, Conwit Street. Clubs, the Anglo-Indian, the Tankerville, the Bagatelle Card Club. In the margin, Holmes had written in his neat hand, the second most dangerous man in London. This is astonishing, said I, as I handed back the volume. The man's career sounds like that of an honorable soldier.
Up to a certain point, yes. He always had nerves of steel. They still tell the tale in India of how he crawled into a drain after a wounded man-eating tiger. But Watson, some trees grow straight for a time and then sprout twisted limbs. It's the same with people. I have a theory that each individual reflects the history of his family lineage. A sudden shift toward good or evil could signify a deep ancestral influence. The man becomes a living echo of his family's past.
That seems a bit fanciful.
Well, I won't insist on it. But whatever the cause, Moran went astray. No scandals, but India grew too hot for him. He retired, came to London, and earned a dark reputation. That's when Moriarty found him. For a time, he served as the professor's chief of staff. Moriarty funded him generously and used him only for top-tier crimes, the kind no ordinary crook could pull off. You may recall the death of Mrs. Stewart of Lauder in 1887?
No, I'm afraid not.
Well, I'm certain Moran was behind it, though nothing was ever proven. He was so well hidden that even when we dismantled the Moriarty gang, we couldn't touch him. Remember when I visited your rooms and put up the shutters? You probably thought I was being paranoid, but I knew this gun existed and that one of the best marksmen in the world would be aiming it. When we were in Switzerland, he followed us with Moriarty. It was he who gave me that nasty 5 minutes on the Reichenbach ledge. I stayed vigilant during my time in France, reading every bit of criminal news, waiting for a chance to trap him. With him free in London, my life was never safe. I couldn't kill him outright. I'd land in jail. I couldn't go to a magistrate. He'd laugh at me. So I waited. Then Ronald Adair was killed. That was my chance. Knowing what I knew, there was no doubt. It had to be Moran. He'd played cards with the boy, followed him home, and shot him through the open window. The bullets alone are enough to hang him. I came back at once. I knew the sentinel would see me and alert Moran. He'd connect my return with the crime and panic. I was sure he'd try to eliminate me immediately, bringing his deadly weapon to do the job. So I gave him a perfect target in the window. I also notified the police, just in case. And by the way, Watson, you spotted the officers in that doorway with perfect accuracy. I picked what I thought was a smart hiding place, never suspecting he'd choose the same one to launch his attack. So, my dear Watson, is there anything left I haven't explained?
Yes. You haven't explained Colonel Moran's motive in murdering the Honorable Ronald Adair.
Ah, my dear Watson, now we step into the realm of conjecture, where even the most logical mind might falter. Everyone may form their own hypothesis based on the available evidence, and yours is just as likely to be right as mine.
So you formed one, then?
I think it's not hard to make sense of the facts. It was revealed in court that Colonel Moran and young Adair had together won a considerable amount of money. Now, Moran definitely cheated, something I've suspected for a long time. I believe that on the day of the murder, Adair discovered Moran's deceit. Most likely, he spoke to him privately and threatened to expose him unless he agreed to resign from the club and vowed never to play cards again. It's improbable that a young man like Adair would immediately cause a major scandal by outing a well-known older man. He probably handled it just as I described. Being banned from his clubs would have been financial and social ruin for Moran, who depended entirely on dishonest winnings. So he killed Adair, who was at that very moment trying to calculate how much money he should return, since he couldn't morally keep his share of Moran's cheating. That's why he locked the door, to avoid the ladies walking in, asking what he was doing with names and coins scattered about. What do you think? Does that hold up?
I've no doubt you've nailed the truth.
We'll see it verified or disproved at the trial. In any case, Colonel Moran won't be troubling us again. Von Herder's famous airgun will now be a part of the Scotland Yard Museum. And once more, Sherlock Holmes is free to dedicate his life to exploring those fascinating little puzzles that London's complex life throws up in such abundance.
And so ended the strange adventure of the empty house. A tale of shadows and silence, of cunning and revenge. London's deadliest marksman was unmasked, and once again, Sherlock Holmes had turned the hunter into the hunted. With Colonel Moran behind bars, and the ghost of Professor Moriarty finally laid to rest, the great detective returned not just to Baker Street, but to the very heart of mystery itself. But for how long? For in the foggy streets of London, darkness always gathers, and Holmes, ever watchful, awaits the next twist in the shadows. Stay curious. The game is far from over. This was the adventure of the empty house, brought to life through echoes of stories. Until next time, dear listener, keep your mind sharp and your revolver closer.